Shadows in Linmore Forest. When I was 22, my cousin Mark, who was a year older than me, convinced me to join him on a camping trip. Mark was the outdoorsy type, a former Eagle Scout who could build a shelter or start a fire with ease. Me? Not so much. I was more of a city kid, and this was one of my first real experiences camping in the wilderness. We decided on Linmore Forest, a dense, sprawling woodland tucked away in the Pacific Northwest. Mark had camped there a few times before and assured me it was the perfect spot, remote, quiet, and scenic. We intentionally chose a weekday to avoid any crowds. The best part of camping, Mark said, is when it's just you, the forest, and nothing else. After a grueling 30-minute hike from the car, carrying all our gear through narrow, winding trails, we found a clearing that seemed perfect. It was just large enough to pitch our 2 tents, set up a fire pit, and have space for our folding chairs. Mark, being the expert, had his tent up in minutes. Meanwhile, I struggled for nearly half an hour, fumbling with poles and ropes. By the time we were done setting up camp, the sun was dipping below the tree line, casting long shadows across the clearing. Mark got to work on the fire pit, arranging stones in a circle while I helped gather wood. It wasn't long before the fire crackled to life, and the smell of burgers sizzling on Mark's portable grill filled the cool evening air. "Just a heads up," Mark said as we ate. "If you hear anything weird out here, it's probably nothing. Animals tend to avoid humans, and bears are rare in this area. It's people you gotta watch out for." He chuckled at his own comment, but the way his eyes flicked toward the darkening tree line made me feel like he wasn't entirely joking. After dinner, we cracked open a couple of beers, played some classic rock on a portable speaker, and talked about everything from old family stories to work. For a while, it was just perfect, just as Mark promised it would be. But the peace didn't last. As the night deepened, we switched to playing cards under the glow of a lantern. That's when we heard it. A low, rhythmic humming echoed from the woods. Mark immediately paused the music on his phone, and we both sat there in silence, straining to listen. The humming continued, faint but deliberate, accompanied by the crunch of footsteps on dry leaves. "Grab the flashlight," Mark whispered. I scrambled to find it in my bag, but by the time I clicked it on and shone the beam into the trees, the sound had stopped. The forest was silent again. "Think it's another camper?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Mark shook his head. "Not this far in. No one hikes this deep for a midweek campout." His tone was calm, but his grip on the can of bear spray told me he was just as unnerved as I was. We tried to shrug it off and return to our game, but the atmosphere had shifted. We kept the music low, and every little crack or rustle from the woods made us glance toward the tree line. That's when it happened. A thick branch, a heavy one, landed with a dull thud right in the middle of our campsite. Mark and I both jumped to our feet, my heart racing as if I'd just run a marathon. The branch hadn't fallen from a tree, it had been thrown. "Hey," Mark shouted into the darkness. "Whoever's out there, knock it off." For a moment there was nothing but silence. Then the sound of footsteps again, moving further away this time. "We need to leave," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. Mark shook his head. "Not in the dark. It's safer to stay put." Reluctantly, I agreed. We each took our bear spray into our tents, and Mark suggested we take turns keeping watch. He volunteered to go first, sitting by the fire with a book while I tried to sleep. But sleep didn't come easily. Every time I closed my eyes, I thought about that branch and the humming. Who or what was out there? Hours passed, and I must have finally drifted off because the next thing I knew, I was waking up. At first, I wasn't sure why. My mind was foggy, still half asleep, but something felt off. That's when I saw it. A face, peering through the mesh of my tent, partially obscured by shadows, was ahead. "Mark?" I whispered, my voice groggy. The figure didn't respond. "Is it my turn to keep watch?" I asked, sitting up slightly. The head lingered for a moment longer, then pulled back. I heard the faint sound of footsteps retreating into the woods. Something clicked in my brain, a moment of clarity that sent a chill down my spine. "Mark?" I called louder this time. There was no answer. I unzipped my tent and stepped out into the campsite. The fire had burned down to embers, casting faint, flickering light. Mark's tent was zipped shut. I unzipped it cautiously, my heart a-pounding. Inside, Mark was sound asleep in his sleeping bag. "Mark, wake up," I hissed, shaking him. He stirred, groaning in annoyance before opening his eyes. "What?" "Someone's here," I said, my voice trembling. It took him a moment to process what I was saying, but when he did, he sat up immediately, grabbing his can of bear spray. We both stood outside his tent, scanning the tree line. That's when the humming started again, low, melodic, and haunting, coming from somewhere just beyond the firelight. Mark and I retreated into his tent, both of us clutching our bear spray like our lives depended on it. We didn't sleep the rest of the night. Every few minutes we'd hear footsteps, the snapping of branches, or that eerie humming. Whatever, or whoever it was, they never showed themselves again. As soon as the first light of dawn broke through the trees, we packed up camp in record time. Neither of us said much on the hike back to the car, but I could tell Mark was just as shaken as I was. It's been years since that night, and I haven't gone camping since. Whatever was out there, it wasn't an animal, and I'll never forget the sight of that face, staring into my tent. Sometimes, the scariest thing in the wilderness isn't the wildlife. It's the other people, the silent visitor. When my father passed away unexpectedly in the fall of 2017, my world fell apart. He left behind a modest cabin, nestled deep in the snowy foothills of Ridgewood Valley, Colorado, near Mount Ashen. My mother, unable to afford the payments after his passing, decided to put it up for sale. She had been working with a realtor to finalize the paperwork, but for the next month, the cabin sat vacant. Needing to escape the chaos of funeral arrangements, lawyers, and family drama, I decided to spend a week alone in the cabin. It was a chance to clear my head, reconnect with my dad's memory, and find some peace. My dog, Onyx, a loyal black German shepherd, was my only companion. The first few days were peaceful. I spent my time snowboarding on the nearby slopes, hiking through the frost-bitten forest trails, and sitting by the crackling fireplace in the evenings, sipping whiskey and watching old DVDs. The cabin was a 2-story structure, simple but cozy, with a steep wooden staircase that led to the bedrooms upstairs. My dad's old room had a sliding glass door that opened onto a small balcony overlooking the surrounding woods. The nearest neighbor's cabin was about half a mile away, and the only sound at night was the howling wind and the occasional rustle of branches. It felt like the perfect place to decompress. But on the third day, something changed. It started when I found footprints in the snow around the cabin. I had just finished playing fetch with Onyx in the backyard and was heading back inside when I noticed them. The prints were large, too large to be mine, and they circled the cabin in an uneven path, trailing off toward the tree line. It had been snowing lightly all morning, so these prints couldn't have been more than an hour or two old. Probably a lost hiker, I told myself, though something about the uneven stride made my skin crawl. That night, as I sat by the fire, Onyx's ears perked up. He bolted from the living room and began pacing near the front door, growling softly. I tried to calm him down, thinking maybe he'd heard an animal outside, but his behavior unnerved me. "All right, boy," I said, grabbing his leash. "Let's see what's out there." We stepped onto the front porch, the cold biting at my face. Onyx tugged at the leash, pulling me toward the side of the cabin where the footprints had been earlier. His nose was to the ground, sniffing intently, but then he stopped abruptly, his gaze snapping upward toward the roof. I followed his line of sight, but saw nothing but the edge of the snowy rooftop. Onyx let out a low, menacing growl, his eyes locked on something I couldn't see. "Come on, let's go back inside," I said, pulling him toward the door. As we stepped inside, I heard it, the faint creak of movement above us. It sounded like footsteps, slow and deliberate, crossing the roof. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. My rational mind tried to explain it away. A branch, snow shifting under its weight, maybe even an animal. But deep down, I knew better. Grabbing a flashlight and a fire poker for good measure, I stepped onto the balcony outside my dad's bedroom to get a better view of the roof. The beam of my flashlight swept across the snow-covered shingles, but they were undisturbed. Relieved, I turned my gaze to the tree line, and that's when I saw it. Perched on a branch about 20 feet from the cabin was a figure, a man, or at least something resembling one. It was crouched in an unnatural position, its arms stretched above its head, gripping a higher branch. Its limbs were impossibly long, its frame skeletal, and its skin deathly pale. Even from a distance, I could see its face, hollow black eyes and a mouth stretched into a grotesque, toothless grin. I stumbled backward, dropping the flashlight. Onyx barked furiously from inside the bedroom, but the thing in the tree didn't move. It just sat there, staring. I retreated inside, locking the balcony door behind me and pulling the curtains shut. My heart was pounding, and my mind raced with thoughts of what I'd just seen. Maybe I was imagining it. Maybe the grief and isolation were playing tricks on me. But the tapping started later that night. It began as a soft, rhythmic sound, like fingers gently drumming on glass. At first, I thought it was the wind rattling the windows. Then I heard the faintest hum, a low, eerie melody that sent chills down my spine. Onyx refused to go near the sliding glass door. He stood at the edge of the room, growling low in his throat, his fur bristling. I stayed awake all night, clutching the fire poker, listening to the humming and tapping, which persisted for what felt like hours. At some point, I must have drifted off, because the next thing I knew, sunlight was streaming through the curtains, and the tapping was gone. I decided to leave that morning. As I packed my things, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The footprints from the day before, they were back. This time, they led from the tree line to the front door, and then back again, as if someone had been pacing outside all night. I loaded my car in record time and called Onyx inside. As we drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror one last time. Standing at the edge of the tree line, half hidden in the shadows, was the figure from the night before. It didn't move. It just watched as we disappeared down the road. The Trap, on Hollow Road. It was late 2016, and I was hunting for a good deal on a smartphone. My old phone was barely holding on, with a cracked screen and a battery that drained faster than a bucket with holes. Money was tight, so I turned to the classifieds, Craigslist, Facebook Marketplace, and anywhere else I could find a bargain. Eventually, I stumbled across a listing for a brand new, factory-sealed phone at a price that seemed too good to be true. $300 for a phone that usually retailed for twice that. The seller, a guy named Evan, seemed straightforward. Over text, he explained that he bought the phone as a gift, but no longer needed it. He even sent me a video of the unopened box to prove it wasn't a scam. Evan told me he'd meet me at a local shopping center, but as the evening went on, his story changed. "I'm actually an hour north now," he texted, "but we can meet halfway. I prefer doing transactions in public places, like police station parking lots. It's safer for both of us." I wasn't thrilled about the drive, but the deal was good, and his reasoning seemed legit. After all, who would try anything shady at a police station? I convinced my best friend, Mia, to tag along. I bribed her with promises of dinner, knowing the trip would feel less sketchy if someone else came with me. It was a Friday night when we hit the road. We laughed, played music, and tried to make the best of the long drive. The GPS led us to a small town surrounded by dark woods and lonely stretches of road. When we arrived at the police station, the lot was eerily empty except for a couple of parked squad cars. No sign of Evan. I texted him and he responded almost immediately. "Sorry, my car broke down a little further up the road. Can you come help me jump it? I've got jumper cables." Mia immediately shook her head. "No way, this feels wrong. Let's just go home." I hesitated. We'd driven an hour, and I didn't want to leave empty-handed. "We'll just drive past," I said. "If it feels weird, we're out of here." Reluctantly, she agreed. Evan sent us his location, a pin on a road called Hollow Lane, about 5 minutes from the station. The area was dense with trees, the kind of place where the streetlights were few and far between. As we approached the spot, we saw the faint glow of hazard lights blinking in the distance. There it was, a black sedan parked on the shoulder of the road. But something was off. The car's windows were dark, and there was no movement inside. The hazard lights flashed rhythmically, like a mechanical heartbeat, and the surrounding woods seemed to swallow the sound of our car's engine. "Keep driving," Mia whispered. I slowed down, trying to get a better look. "Maybe he's inside trying to keep warm," I said, though even I didn't believe it. As we passed, I noticed something chilling. The driver's side door was slightly ajar, but no one was around. Before I could even process it, my phone buzzed. A text from Evan. "Why didn't you stop? I saw you drive by." Mia's face paled. "He's watching us." I hit the gas, speeding down the road without looking back. My phone buzzed again, but I ignored it. The only thing I wanted was to get as far away from Hollow Lane as possible. We stopped at a small diner on the edge of town to regroup. It was nearly empty, save for a waitress behind the counter and an older couple in one of the booths. We ordered coffee and tried to laugh off the situation, though the unease lingered like a shadow. That's when the door opened. A man in a navy hoodie walked in, his head down and his hands stuffed into his pockets. He sat at the counter, ordered a coffee, and glanced around the diner. When his eyes met mine, my stomach dropped. It was him. I recognized his voice when he thanked the waitress, the same voice I'd spoken to over the phone earlier. "Mia," I whispered, "we need to leave. Now." She turned to look, but he was already watching us. His lips curled into the faintest smile, and he casually stood up, cradling his coffee as he walked toward the door. We hurried out, leaving a crumpled bill on the table. As we got into my car, I saw him standing near a black sedan in the parking lot, the same car we'd passed on Hollow Lane. My hands were shaking as I fumbled with the keys. "Hurry up," Mia hissed. As I pulled out of the lot, he began walking toward us. By the time we hit the main road, I was flooring it. I thought we were in the clear until a warning light blinked on my dashboard. Low tire pressure. My stomach sank as I pulled over to check. Sure enough, the back tire was slashed, the rubber shredded like it had been carved with a knife. "Get back in the car," Mia urged. "We'll drive on the rim if we have to." I managed to get the spare on in record time, my hands shaking the entire time. Every sound from the woods felt like a footstep. Every shadow felt like someone watching. We made it back to the highway and didn't stop until we were miles away. Even now, I wonder what would have happened if we'd stopped on Hollow Lane or stayed at the diner longer. I still see his face sometimes when I close my eyes, the way he smiled, knowing he'd scared us. Whoever Evan really was, he wasn't selling a phone. The reunion that never was. I had been seeing this woman, Leia, for about 2 weeks. We met on a dating app, and while things were moving quickly, I couldn't deny how intriguing she was. Leia was confident, charming, and mysterious in a way that kept me hooked. On our second date, she came out with my friends for drinks. They didn't say much about her at the time, but I noticed how quiet they got when she left the table to grab a drink. When I asked them what they thought, they shrugged it off. "She's interesting," my buddy Sam said. That was all he would say. The third time we hung out, Leia invited me to her high school reunion. She said it was being hosted by a wealthy former classmate at Hizetta's house and that she didn't want to go alone. I felt like I owed her. She'd come out with my friends, after all. So I reluctantly agreed. The night of the party, Leia was dressed to kill. She wore a sleek black dress and smiled at me in a way that felt almost predatory. I chalked it up to my imagination, shook off the weird feeling, and drove us to the house. The house was massive. It sat at the end of a long, gated driveway and looked more like a small mansion than a home. But despite how fancy it was, there weren't many cars in the driveway. "Where's everyone else?" I asked, as we walked to the front door. "Oh, they're probably just parking out back," Leia said with a wave of her hand. The second we stepped inside, I felt out of place. The house was dimly lit, and the atmosphere was heavy. A small group of people milled about the living room, and they all turned to look at us when we entered. Their stares were unsettling, lingering a second too long, as if they were sizing me up. Leia led me through the room, introducing me to a few people. They were polite but distant, asking strange, pointed questions. "Where do you live? Do you have family nearby? What do you do for work?" Friendly bunch, I joked to Leia after we stepped away. "They're just curious," she said with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. The more people we met, the weirder I felt. Most of them seemed older than Leah's supposed age of 28. A lot older. Their clothes, their mannerisms, none of it fit what I imagined a high school reunion would be like. At one point, I whispered to Leia, "Are you sure these are all people from your class? Some of them look like they're pushing 40. She laughed nervously. "Yeah, well, some people don't age as well as others." The uneasy feeling in my stomach only grew. "Where's the host?" I asked, glancing around. Leia paused for a moment before answering. "Oh, he's around somewhere. I'll introduce you when I see him." Her vague response didn't help my nerves. About 30 minutes into the party, I excused myself to use the bathroom. In reality, I just needed a break from the stairs and the suffocating atmosphere. As I wandered down a dark hallway, I passed a few closed doors. That's when I heard it, a soft, muffled sound, like someone crying. I stopped in my tracks, my pulse quickening. The sound was coming from one of the rooms. I hesitated, debating whether to check it out, but my curiosity got the better of me. I slowly turned the doorknob and peeked inside. The room was dark, illuminated only by the faint glow of a small TV in the corner. A man sat slumped on the floor, his face buried in his hands. He looked up when the door creaked open, and his expression was a mixture of fear and desperation. "You shouldn't be here," he whispered. What do you mean? I asked, stepping inside. She lied to you, didn't she? He said, his voice trembling. Whatever she told you, it's not true. None of this is what it seems. I felt a chill crawl up my spine. What are you talking about? Who are you? He shook his head. Just leave. Leave now, before it's too late. Before I could press him for more, footsteps echoed in the hallway. I turned to see Leah standing in the doorway, her expression unreadable. What are you doing in here? She asked, her voice sharp. Let's go, she said, grabbing my arm. Her grip was tighter than I expected, and her nails dug into my skin. She led me back to the main room, where the other guests were waiting. Their eyes followed us as we entered, and their smiles were unnervingly wide. I don't feel well, I said, trying to sound casual. I think I should head out. Leah's hand tightened on my arm. You can't leave yet, she said, her tone suddenly icy. The host hasn't met you. I don't think I need to meet him, I said, trying to pull away. The room grew silent, and the guests closed in around us. I could feel their eyes on me, their gazes heavy and cold. Stay, Leah whispered, her face inches from mine. It's rude to leave before the main event. I yanked my arm free and bolted for the door. The guests didn't try to stop me, but their laughter echoed behind me as I ran. When I reached my car, I didn't look back. I floored it, my hands shaking on the wheel. Leah texted me once asking why I left so abruptly. I didn't respond. Instead, I looked up her phone number online. The name that came up wasn't Leah. It was someone else entirely. I also realized something else. Both times I picked her up for our dates, she was already waiting outside. I had never seen where she lived. To this day, I don't know what that party really was or what would have happened if I had stayed. But sometimes I still hear their laughter in my nightmares. Footsteps in the dark. I was 8 years old when it happened. My parents had me much later in life, and my older siblings were both in their 20s by the time I was in grade school. Being the youngest, I was used to being alone in the house with my mom and dad, while my siblings were off at college or work. But on this particular night, something happened that still sends chills down my spine. It was a cold winter night, and I woke up to the sound of raised voices downstairs. I cracked my bedroom door open and peeked out, listening to my mom and dad arguing in hushed but frantic tones. "Call them back," my mom was saying, her voice shaking. "I already did," my dad replied. "They're on the way." I called out from the top of the stairs, "Mom? Dad? What's going on?" My mom looked up at me, her face pale and tense. "Sweetheart, go back to bed. Everything's fine." Her voice didn't sound fine. Still, I listened, retreating to my room and crawling under the covers. Minutes later, I heard the front door slam shut. The house fell eerily silent, and I realized my parents had left. I didn't understand why at the time, but I assumed it must have been some kind of emergency. I tried to go back to sleep, but every little creak and groan of the house seemed amplified in the silence. Then I heard something unmistakable, the sound of the front door opening and closing again. I felt a wave of relief. My parents must have come back. Footsteps moved through the house, slow, deliberate, and heavy. It was strange. Neither of my parents usually walked that way. "Mom?" I called out, sitting up in bed. No response. "Dad?" Still nothing. The footsteps moved closer, climbing the stairs one slow step at a time. My bedroom door was slightly ajar, and I stared at the crack, my heart pounding. A figure appeared in the doorway, a tall, shadowy silhouette. I could barely make out the shape of a head, shoulders, and arms in the faint moonlight streaming through my window. "Chris?" I asked, thinking it might be my older brother. The figure didn't move or respond. "Who's there?" I whispered, my voice trembling. Still no answer. The figure simply stood there, motionless. Eventually the shadow turned and walked back down the stairs. I heard it moving around the house, opening and closing drawers in the kitchen, then the faint creak of the fridge door. I told myself it had to be my dad, maybe looking for something to eat. But why hadn't he answered me? Curiosity got the better of me. I crept out of bed and tiptoed down the stairs, keeping to the shadows. The house was dark, except for the faint glow of the fridge light spilling into the kitchen. That's when I saw him. A man I didn't recognize stood in the middle of the kitchen, rummaging through the drawers. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and wore a dark jacket with the hood pulled up. "Dad?" I said, my voice barely above a whisper. The man froze. Slowly he turned his head to look at me. The moment our eyes met, he smiled, a cold, eerie smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Go back to bed," he said, his voice deep and rough. I bolted up the stairs, my heart pounding in my chest. I dove under the covers, trembling, and waited. Minutes passed. The house was silent again, but I didn't dare go back downstairs. I didn't even breathe loudly, terrified the man might hear me. Eventually, I heard the front door creak open and shut softly. I must have fallen asleep at some point, because the next thing I remember is my parents shaking me awake. It was morning, and sunlight streamed through my bedroom window. "Are you okay?" my mom asked, her voice frantic. I nodded, still groggy. "There was a man in the house last night," I said. My parents exchanged a horrified look. My mom ran downstairs to check the locks while my dad stayed with me. I found out later that they had left the house the night before because my older brother, Chris, had been in a car accident. They'd rushed to the hospital in such a panic that they'd forgotten to lock the front door. When I told them about the man, my dad grabbed his gun and searched the house from top to bottom, but there was no sign of anyone. My mom called the police, and an officer came to take my statement. I overheard my parents talking later, trying to figure out what the man's intentions might have been. Nothing appeared to be stolen, which made it even creepier. Why had he been there? Why hadn't he hurt me? To this day, I still think about that man, the way he smiled at me, the way he told me to go back to bed. I don't know what he wanted, or what might have happened if I hadn't run back upstairs. But the scariest part? I'll never forget the sound of those slow, deliberate footsteps on the stairs. The night watcher. A few years ago, I worked as an overnight caregiver for people with disabilities. Most of my clients were elderly, and though the work was emotionally taxing, I found it fulfilling. But there's one job I took that I'll never forget, and never take another like it again. It was a one-night gig, arranged through an agency I worked with. A woman named Karen needed someone to watch over her elderly mother, Linda, who had severe dementia. Karen had to work the overnight shift and couldn't leave her mother alone in the house. When I arrived, the house was dimly lit and eerily quiet. It was a small two-story place, a little run-down but not neglected. Karen greeted me at the door, thanked me for coming on short notice, and introduced me to her mother, Linda. Linda was sitting in an armchair in the living room, staring blankly at the wall. She gave me a faint smile when Karen introduced us, but her eyes didn't really focus on me. She looked lost, like her mind was elsewhere entirely. "She sometimes gets confused at night," Karen explained. "She might wander the house or get upset, but she's harmless. Just be patient with her and guide her back to bed if she gets up." I assured her I could handle it. After all, I'd dealt with dementia patients before. Karen left around 9:30 p.m., and I settled into the living room with a book, keeping an ear out for any movement upstairs where Linda's bedroom was. The first hour passed quietly. Occasionally I'd hear creaks from the old wooden floors, but I told myself it was just the house settling. Around 11 p.m., I heard footsteps. I looked up at the ceiling, tracking the sound as it moved from one end of the upstairs hallway to the other. "Linda?" I called out. The footsteps stopped. I waited a moment, listening, but there was no response. Assuming she was just wandering, I made my way upstairs to check on her. When I got to her room, the door was slightly ajar. I peeked inside, expecting to find her out of bed, but to my surprise, she was lying down, her back to me. "Linda?" I said softly. She didn't respond, so I stepped closer. Her breathing was slow and steady. She was asleep. I went back downstairs, chalking the noise up to my imagination, but just as I sat down, I heard the footsteps again, this time coming from the staircase. I turned my head, expecting to see Linda at the top of the stairs, but there was no one there. A chill ran down my spine. I stood up, my pulse quickening, and called out again. "Linda?" Silence. I checked the front door, making sure it was locked, then double-checked the back door. Both were secure. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I sat back down and tried to focus on my book, but every little sound put me on edge. An hour passed without incident, and I started to relax, convincing myself I was just being paranoid. Then I heard it, a loud bang from the kitchen. I shot up from the couch, my heart pounding. It sounded like something heavy had been slammed against the wall. Grabbing my phone, I cautiously made my way to the kitchen. The room was empty, but one of the cabinet doors was swinging open. On the counter below it, a glass had shattered, pieces scattered across the floor. I stared at the mess, trying to piece together what had happened. Had it fallen out of the cabinet on its own? But how? A voice behind me made me jump. "Who are you?" I spun around to see Linda standing in the doorway. Her face was blank, but her eyes were wide, fixed on me with an unsettling intensity. "It's okay, Linda," I said, trying to keep my voice calm. "I'm here to take care of you, remember." She didn't respond. Instead, she started yelling, her voice shrill and panicked. "Who are you? Why are you in my house?" I tried to reassure her, but she backed away, her shouting growing louder. I followed her up the stairs, coaxing her toward her bedroom. She kept muttering things under her breath, things I couldn't quite make out, but her tone was angry, almost accusing. When we reached her room, she stopped suddenly in the doorway. "They don't like you," she whispered. I froze. "What?" She turned to look at me, her expression eerily calm. "The ones upstairs. They don't want you here." A cold shiver ran down my spine. "Let's get you back to bed," I said, guiding her into the room. She didn't resist, but as I tucked her in, she kept muttering, "They don't like you. They don't like you." I left the room as quickly as I could, closing the door behind me. By now I was on edge. I went back downstairs, grabbed my things, and sat by the front door, counting the hours until Karen came home. I must have dozed off at some point, because I woke up to the sound of a door creaking. I looked around, disoriented, and realized it was coming from upstairs. The air felt heavy, suffocating. I didn't want to go back up there, but I couldn't just ignore it. I grabbed a flashlight and cautiously climbed the stairs. Linda's door was open. Inside, the bed was empty. I called out her name, but there was no response. The hallway stretched before me, dimly lit by the moonlight filtering through a window at the end. I moved toward the sound of the creaking, my flashlight beam trembling as it swept across the walls. When I reached the spare bedroom, I froze. The door was slightly ajar, and through the crack, I could see Linda standing in the center of the room. She was facing the wall, motionless. "Linda?" I said, my voice barely above a whisper. She didn't move. I pushed the door open slowly, and that's when I saw it. She wasn't alone. A shadowy figure stood in the corner, its outline barely visible in the darkness. It was tall, impossibly tall, with long, spindly limbs that seemed to stretch into the shadows. I stumbled backward, dropping the flashlight. By the time I scrambled to pick it up and shone the beam into the room, the figure was gone. Linda turned to face me, her expression blank. "They don't like you," she said again. I ran. I bolted down the stairs, grabbed my coat, and waited outside until Karen got home. When I told her what had happened, she laughed it off, saying Linda sometimes talked to people who weren't there. But I knew what I saw. I never took another job at that house. The roommate. When I moved out of state for work a few years ago, I was desperate to find somewhere cheap to live. I didn't know anyone in the area, and renting a whole place by myself was out of the question. So, I turned to the usual websites: Facebook Marketplace, Craigslist, and even subreddits for the local area. That's how I found Liam. Liam responded to my post on Facebook, saying he had a spare room available in his house. He seemed normal enough, polite, straightforward, and friendly. He even offered to give me a video tour of the house over FaceTime, which put me at ease. The house itself was modest but clean, with a small yard and a quiet location about 10 minutes from my new office. "It's just me living here," Liam said during the call. "I keep to myself, so you'd have plenty of space and privacy." He also mentioned that the previous tenant had just moved out, so the room was fully furnished and ready for someone to move in immediately. It all sounded perfect, and the price was reasonable. I didn't get any weird vibes, and since I was in a hurry to settle in before my new job started, I agreed. A week later, I packed my car and drove to my new home. Liam was waiting for me on the front porch, smiling and waving as I pulled into the driveway. The first thing I noticed about him was how short he was. I don't know why it stood out to me, but I wasn't expecting him to be so small. He seemed even quieter and more reserved in person, but that was fine with me. I wasn't looking for a best friend, just a roommate. The room he showed me was clean, cozy, and neatly made up with fresh bedding. Everything seemed in order, and I started to feel relieved. Maybe this whole situation wasn't as risky as it seemed. The first couple of days went smoothly. Liam kept to himself, just as he said he would, and the house was always quiet. But by the end of the first week, small, unsettling things started to happen. It started with my laundry. One night, I went to throw a load of clothes into the washer, and I realized that something felt off. The clothes in my hamper weren't arranged the way I'd left them. I couldn't say for sure, but it felt like someone had rifled through them. I brushed it off. Maybe I'd just been in a rush that morning and hadn't noticed. But then I noticed something else. One of my bras was missing. I tore through my room, searching everywhere. But it was gone. My stomach churned at the thought of someone taking it. I knew it wasn't me, but I wasn't ready to accuse Liam. Maybe it had just gotten lost somehow. Still, the idea unsettled me enough that I decided to install a lock on my bedroom door. I went to the hardware store the next day and swapped out the doorknob for one with a key lock while Liam was at work. That night, Liam came home late. I was already in bed when I heard him walking down the hall. Then came the knocking on my bedroom door. It wasn't an urgent knock. It was slow and deliberate, like someone tapping their knuckles against the wood, waiting for a response. "Hey," Liam's voice called through the door. "Why'd you put a lock on your door?" I froze, my heart pounding. How did he know I'd changed it? I pretended to be asleep, not wanting to answer, but the knocking continued for another minute before it stopped. The next morning, I woke up to a text from him. "We need to talk about that lock." I responded with an apology, explaining that it made me feel safer. He replied curtly, "Take it off. This is my house." I felt uneasy, but I didn't want to rock the boat, so I agreed to remove the lock. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. That weekend, a stranger knocked on the front door. It was a young woman about my age, with dark circles under her eyes and an anxious expression. "Do you live here?" she asked. When I nodded, her face twisted with concern. "You need to leave. You shouldn't be here." Confused and alarmed, I asked her what she meant. "I used to live here," she said. "I just wanted to warn you. Liam isn't who you think he is. He's dangerous." My stomach dropped. "What are you talking about?" She hesitated before pulling out her phone and showing me a photo. It was a news article with a mugshot of Liam. According to the article, he'd been arrested years ago for stalking and harassment, with restraining orders filed against him by multiple women. "I didn't know he was renting the room out again," she said. "Please be careful." I was horrified. As soon as she left, I started packing my things. I didn't care about the rent I'd paid. I just wanted to get out. I texted Liam, telling him I needed to move out for family reasons. He responded calmly, saying we'd discuss it when he got home. When he arrived later that night, his demeanor had changed. He wasn't calm. He was angry. "Did someone come by?" he asked, his voice low and tense. "What do you mean?" I asked, trying to act confused. "You're running because someone told you something," he said, stepping closer. "Isn't that right?" I tried to deny it, but his expression turned dark. "Don't believe everything you hear," he said. "People like to lie." I mumbled something about needing to leave early the next morning and retreated to my room, locking the door behind me, even without his permission. That night, I woke up to the feeling of someone watching me. When I opened my eyes, Liam was sitting at the foot of my bed, his face illuminated by the moonlight streaming through the window. I screamed, but he lunged forward, clamping a hand over my mouth. "Shh," he whispered. "I'm not going to hurt you." I struggled, my heart racing, but he held me down. "You don't need to leave," he said softly. "We can figure this out." I managed to wriggle free and bolted for the door. Liam grabbed at me, but I yanked it open and ran out of the house, barefoot and clutching my phone. I called the police from the neighbor's yard, shaking so hard I could barely hold the phone. When the cops arrived, Liam tried to play it off as a misunderstanding. But when they searched his room, they found several things that didn't belong to him, including my missing bra. I don't know what Liam's true intentions were, but I'm certain they weren't innocent. I moved into a studio apartment the next day.